What happens when centuries of tradition collide with simple human dignity? When a single moment of courage transforms an entire courtroom. Sometimes the most powerful truths come from the most unexpected sources, spoken by those society overlooks or underestimates. In a world where appearances often matter more than substance, where uniforms can either command respect or invite scrutiny, one man's quiet strength would challenge everything a courtroom thought they knew about honor, service, and what it truly means to serve one's country. This is the story of how a simple question about military protocol became a lesson in respect, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond between those who serve. It's about a moment when truth cut through prejudice like a sword through silk, and an entire room of people learned that heroism doesn't always come wrapped in the package we expect. Get ready for a story that will restore your faith in justice, honor, and the power of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Marcus Thompson adjusted his military dress uniform one final time. Every button gleamed, every crease was razor-sharp, and his polished boots reflected the light like mirrors. He had been preparing for this day for months, knowing that his testimony could make or break the case against the defense contractor who had been defrauding military families. Marcus stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that spoke of years of physical training. His dark skin showed the weathered lines of someone who had spent countless hours under the desert sun, and his eyes held the steady gaze of a man who had seen too much but never lost his sense of duty. The red fabric across his chest bore the unmistakable insignia of the Queen's Royal Guard, a position he had earned through years of exemplary service in the British Army's most elite unit. As he climbed the courthouse steps, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Today wasn't just about one man's testimony. It was about justice for hundreds of military families who had been cheated out of proper housing, medical care, and basic necessities while deployed overseas. The defense contractor, Harrison Military Solutions, had been cutting corners and pocketing millions while soldiers lived in substandard conditions that put their lives at risk. The case had personal meaning for Marcus. His younger brother David had been stationed at one of the affected bases in Afghanistan, where faulty electrical systems installed by Harrison's cut-rate contractors had caused a fire that injured 12 soldiers. David had spent 6 months in a burn unit, fighting for his life while Harrison's executives counted their profits. Now, finally, there was a chance for accountability. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere buzzed with tension. Lawyers shuffled papers and whispered urgent consultations while reporters filled the gallery, their cameras ready to capture every moment of what promised to be a landmark case. The prosecution team had worked for 3 years to build their case, gathering evidence from dozens of military installations and interviewing hundreds of affected service members. Marcus took his seat in the witness waiting area, his uniform drawing curious glances from other witnesses and court staff. He was the prosecution's star witness, the man whose detailed documentation and fearless reporting had exposed the full scope of Harrison's fraud. As a logistics officer with the Royal Guard, Marcus had been temporarily assigned to oversee quality control at several bases where Harrison held contracts. What he had discovered there had shocked even his seasoned military sensibilities. The corruption wasn't just about money. It was about basic human dignity and the sacred trust between a nation and those who serve it. Marcus had documented everything: the contaminated water systems that made soldiers sick, the inferior body armor that could have gotten them killed, the substandard building materials that created dangerous living conditions. Each piece of evidence represented real people whose lives had been put at risk for the sake of corporate profit. Judge Patricia Whitfield entered the courtroom at precisely 9 o'clock, her black robes flowing behind her as she took her place at the bench. She was known throughout the legal community as a no-nonsense jurist who demanded respect for her courtroom and had little patience for theatrics. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her piercing blue eyes seemed to take in every detail as she surveyed the packed courtroom. The prosecution team consisted of 3 attorneys led by Sarah Chun, a brilliant prosecutor who had made her career fighting corporate fraud. She had volunteered for this case specifically because her own father had served in the military, and she understood the sacred nature of the military's mission. Beside her sat Robert Martinez, a former military lawyer who brought crucial insider knowledge to the prosecution, and Jennifer Walsh, a young attorney whose research skills had helped build the massive evidence file. On the defense side sat Harrison Military Solutions' high-powered legal team, led by the notorious corporate defender Richard Sterling. Sterling was known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to discredit witnesses, particularly those from working-class backgrounds. He commanded fees of over $1,000 an hour and had never lost a major corporate fraud case. His strategy was always the same: attack the credibility of the witnesses and make the jury doubt their motivations. The jury selection had taken 3 days, with both sides carefully choosing 12 citizens who would ultimately decide the fate of one of the largest military contractors in the country. The final jury included a retired teacher, a small business owner, 2 factory workers, a nurse, a construction foreman, an accountant, a retail manager, a social worker, a mechanic, a college professor, and a homemaker. They represented a cross-section of American society, people who would need to understand complex financial documents and technical military procedures to reach a just verdict. As the morning progressed, the prosecution laid out their case with methodical precision. They presented financial documents showing how Harrison had systematically overcharged the military while delivering substandard goods and services. Expert witnesses explained how the company's corners cutting had created dangerous conditions that violated both military regulations and basic safety standards. The defense's strategy became clear during their opening statement. Sterling painted Harrison as a patriotic company that had made honest mistakes while trying to support the troops under difficult conditions. He suggested that any problems were the result of the inherent challenges of operating in war zones, not deliberate fraud. Most importantly, he began laying the groundwork to attack the credibility of the military witnesses, suggesting they were motivated by personal grievances rather than genuine concerns about safety and fraud. Marcus watched from the witness room as the morning testimony unfolded. Through the closed-circuit television monitor, he could see the faces of the jury as they absorbed the complex details of the case. Some looked confused by the technical testimony, while others appeared genuinely outraged by the evidence of corporate misconduct. He knew that when his turn came to testify, he would need to make the human cost of Harrison's actions clear and understandable. The prosecution's first witness was Colonel Janet Morrison, a career officer who had overseen military housing at several affected bases. Her testimony was devastating as she described the deplorable conditions that Harrison's subcontractors had created. She showed photographs of moldy barracks, broken heating systems, and electrical hazards that could have killed soldiers. Her voice remained steady and professional as she detailed how repeatedly reporting these problems to Harrison had resulted in only minimal, temporary fixes. Sterling's cross-examination of Colonel Morrison was brutal. He questioned her competence, suggested she was biased against private contractors, and insinuated that she was seeking attention by exaggerating the problems. But Morrison held her ground, calmly referring to her documentation and refusing to be rattled by Sterling's aggressive tactics. The jury seemed impressed by her composure and professionalism. The second witness was Dr. Michael Chun, a water safety expert who had tested the water systems at Harrison-managed facilities. His testimony revealed that contaminated water at 3 bases had caused hundreds of cases of dysentery and other serious illnesses among deployed troops. The contamination was the direct result of Harrison's decision to use cheaper, substandard filtration systems that they knew were inadequate for the job. Sterling's cross-examination focused on the complexity of water treatment in challenging environments, but Dr. Chin was prepared with examples of other contractors who had successfully provided safe water under similar conditions. He made it clear that the contamination was entirely preventable and resulted from Harrison's deliberate choice to prioritize profits over soldier safety. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus felt his nervous energy building. Tomorrow would be his day to testify, and he knew that everything would depend on his ability to communicate the truth clearly and credibly. Sterling would undoubtedly try to destroy his reputation and credibility, but Marcus was prepared for that. He had spent years documenting Harrison's wrongdoing with meticulous care, and he had the evidence to back up every claim he would make. The day's final witness was Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, whose unit had been housed in a Harrison-built facility that had partially collapsed during a minor earthquake. 3 soldiers had been seriously injured, and only luck had prevented deaths. Rodriguez described how the building's substandard construction had been obvious to anyone with basic knowledge of earthquake safety, but Harrison had certified it as meeting all requirements. Sterling's cross-examination of Rodriguez was particularly harsh. He questioned her education level, her understanding of engineering principles, and her motivations for testifying. But Rodriguez, a veteran of 3 deployments, refused to be intimidated. She spoke with quiet dignity about her responsibility to her fellow soldiers and her duty to speak the truth, regardless of the personal cost. As court adjourned for the day, Marcus felt the weight of tomorrow's responsibility. He was not just representing himself, or even just the directly affected soldiers. He was representing every service member who had ever trusted their government to provide safe, adequate support while they risked their lives in service to their country. The evidence was overwhelming, but evidence meant nothing if the jury didn't believe the witnesses who presented it. That evening, Marcus returned to his hotel room and spent hours reviewing his notes and preparing for what he knew would be the most important testimony of his life. He thought about his brother David, still recovering from his injuries, and about all the other soldiers whose sacrifices had been dishonored by Harrison's greed. Tomorrow, he would have his chance to speak for all of them. The prosecution team had warned him about what to expect from Sterling's cross-examination. The defense attorney would try to paint him as a disgruntled soldier seeking attention or revenge. He would question Marcus's qualifications, his motivations, and his character. But Marcus was ready for all of that. He had the truth on his side, and he had learned in his military career that the truth, properly presented, was the most powerful weapon of all. As he prepared for bed, Marcus looked at his uniform hanging carefully in the hotel closet. Every ribbon and medal represented years of dedicated service, sacrifice, and commitment to something larger than himself. Tomorrow, that uniform would speak for him before he ever said a word. It would tell the jury who he was and what he stood for. And then, his words would do the rest. The second day of the trial began with an unexpected tension in the air. Word had spread overnight about the case through social media and news coverage, and the courthouse was surrounded by protesters, veterans groups, and military families demanding justice. The gallery was packed with spectators, including several active-duty service members who had taken leave to attend the proceedings. Marcus arrived at the courthouse an hour early, wanting time to center himself before his testimony. He had spent the previous evening in prayer and meditation, knowing that the day ahead would test not just his memory and preparation, but his character under the most intense scrutiny. The prosecution team met with him in a small conference room to go over his testimony one final time. Sarah Chen looked confident but concerned as she reviewed the key points of Marcus's testimony. "Remember," she told him, "Sterling is going to try every trick in the book to discredit you. He'll attack your background, your education, even your appearance. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and don't let him bait you into losing your temper." Robert Martinez, the former military prosecutor, added his own advice. "You're not just a witness today, Marcus. You're representing every soldier who's ever been let down by the system. The jury needs to see that you're someone they can trust, someone who puts duty and honor above personal gain." When court convened at 9 o'clock sharp, Judge Whitfield seemed particularly stern as she addressed the packed courtroom. "I want to make something absolutely clear," she announced. "This courtroom will maintain the highest standards of decorum and respect. Any outbursts, demonstrations, or inappropriate behavior will result in immediate removal and possible contempt charges. We are here to pursue justice according to the law, not to stage a political rally." The prosecution called Marcus as their next witness. As he walked to the witness stand, his military bearing was evident in every step. His spine was straight, his shoulders square, and his eyes focused straight ahead. The courtroom fell completely silent as he took his oath, his deep voice carrying clearly as he swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Sarah Chen began her direct examination with Marcus's background and qualifications. She established his 17 years of military service, his multiple deployments to combat zones, his spotless service record, and his current position with the Queen's Royal Guard. The jury listened intently as Marcus described his training in logistics, quality control, and military procurement procedures. Sergeant Major Thompson, Chun continued, "Can you explain to the jury how you first became involved with Harrison Military Solutions contracts?" Marcus's voice was calm and professional as he answered. "In 2018, I was assigned as a quality control liaison for several overseas installations where Harrison held major contracts. My job was to ensure that all goods and services met military specifications and safety standards. Within the first week of my assignment, I identified serious deficiencies in Harrison's performance. The prosecution then guided Marcus through a detailed account of the problems he had discovered. Using photographs, documents, and technical specifications, Marcus explained how Harrison had systematically substituted inferior materials and services while charging premium prices. His testimony was devastating in its thoroughness and precision. Marcus described visiting a forward operating base in Afghanistan where Harrison was supposed to provide water purification services. Instead of the military-grade systems specified in the contract, he found civilian equipment that was completely inadequate for the harsh environment and heavy usage requirements. The filtration units were failing every few days, Marcus testified. Soldiers were getting sick, and the backup systems couldn't handle the load. When I contacted Harrison's site supervisor, he told me the equipment was good enough for government work. The courtroom stirred at this phrase, and several jurors shook their heads in disgust. Marcus continued with similar examples from multiple installations. Substandard body armor that wouldn't stop the bullets it was rated for, communications equipment that failed in extreme temperatures, and building materials so inferior that structures became dangerous in routine weather conditions. Chun introduced hundreds of documents that Marcus had meticulously prepared, including photographs, test results, correspondence with Harrison officials, and detailed reports he had filed through military channels. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of systematic fraud that put soldiers' lives at risk for the sake of corporate profits. Sergeant Major Thompson, Chun asked, "What was Harrison's response when you documented these deficiencies?" Marcus's jaw tightened slightly as he answered. "Initially, they promised to fix the problems. But the fixes were always temporary and minimal. More concerning, I began receiving pressure from Harrison's corporate headquarters to modify my reports or to focus on other contractors instead. They offered me consulting opportunities and implied that my military career could benefit from being more cooperative with their operations." The jury was clearly engaged now, leaning forward to catch every word. Chun walked Marcus through the intimidation campaign that Harrison had mounted against him, including veiled threats, attempts to have him reassigned, and efforts to discredit his reports with his military superiors. "How did you respond to this pressure?" Chun asked. "I documented everything and continued to do my job according to military regulations and my oath as a soldier," Marcus replied firmly. "No amount of pressure or inducement could make me compromise the safety of my fellow service members." Chun's direct examination took nearly 3 hours, during which Marcus presented a comprehensive case against Harrison that was both technically detailed and emotionally compelling. His military bearing and obvious credibility made him an ideal witness, and the jury seemed completely convinced by his testimony. When Chun finished her direct examination, Judge Whitfield called for a lunch recess. The courtroom buzzed with conversation as spectators discussed the devastating testimony they had just heard. Legal experts in the gallery were already predicting that Marcus's testimony alone could be enough to convict Harrison on multiple fraud charges. During the lunch break, Marcus remained in the witness room, preparing for what everyone knew would be a brutal cross-examination. Sterling had built his reputation on destroying credible witnesses, and he would undoubtedly pull out every stop to discredit Marcus's testimony. When court reconvened, Sterling approached the witness stand with the confidence of a predator who had spotted weakness in his prey. His expensive suit and arrogant demeanor created a stark contrast with Marcus's military uniform and dignified bearing. "Sergeant Major Thompson," Sterling began with a condescending tone, you've presented quite a story to this jury today. But I think we need to examine your real motivations for these accusations against my client. Sterling's cross-examination strategy became immediately apparent. He questioned Marcus's educational background, noting that he had enlisted in the military straight out of high school rather than attending college. He suggested that Marcus lacked the technical knowledge to properly evaluate complex military systems and contracts. "You're not an engineer, are you, Sergeant Major?" Sterling asked snidely. "No, sir," Marcus replied calmly. "But I have 17 years of experience working with military equipment in combat conditions. I know when something doesn't work, and I know when soldiers' lives are at risk." Sterling continued his attack, suggesting that Marcus was motivated by personal ambition rather than genuine concern for safety. He implied that Marcus had fabricated or exaggerated problems to advance his own career and gain attention from his superiors. "Isn't it true, Sergeant Major, that you saw this case as an opportunity to become famous? To write a book, perhaps, or to launch a career as a consultant?" Marcus's response was measured but firm. "Sir, I testified because I swore an oath to protect and defend. That oath doesn't have an expiration date, and it doesn't include exceptions for powerful corporations." The cross-examination continued for over 2 hours, with Sterling attacking every aspect of Marcus's testimony and character. He questioned his memory, his documentation methods, his relationships with other witnesses, and even his mental health. But Marcus remained unflappable, answering each question with calm professionalism and referring consistently to the documented evidence he had compiled. As the afternoon wore on, Sterling's attacks became increasingly desperate and personal. He questioned Marcus's right to wear his military decorations, suggested that his assignment to the Royal Guard was somehow suspicious, and implied that his testimony was part of some larger conspiracy against American defense contractors. The turning point came when Sterling made what would prove to be a fatal error in judgment. Looking directly at Marcus's uniform with obvious disdain, he asked, "Tell me, Sergeant Major, don't you think it's a bit presumptuous to wear all these ribbons and decorations to court? Are you trying to impress the jury with your costume?" The courtroom fell completely silent. Several jurors visibly recoiled at Sterling's words, and Judge Whitfield's expression darkened. Marcus remained perfectly composed, but his eyes flashed with controlled anger. "Sir," Marcus replied quietly, "this is not a costume. This is the uniform of Her Majesty's Royal Guard, which I have earned the right to wear through 17 years of dedicated service to my country and my oath." Sterling, perhaps sensing he had overstepped but unable to back down, pressed further. "But isn't it true that you're really just trying to use your military service to manipulate this jury's emotions rather than dealing with the facts?" Before Marcus could answer, Judge Whitfield intervened sharply. "Mr. Sterling, you will treat this witness and his service record with appropriate respect. The court recognizes Sergeant Major Thompson's right to appear in uniform, and your questions about his attire are completely inappropriate." But Sterling had made his point, and the damage was done to his own case. The jury had clearly been offended by his disrespectful treatment of a decorated service member, and their faces showed their disapproval. What Sterling had intended as an attack on Marcus's credibility had instead revealed his own character and values. Marcus's final answer to Sterling's barrage was simple and devastating. "Mr. Sterling, every ribbon on this uniform represents time served in harm's way, protecting the freedoms that allow you to practice law in this courtroom. I wear this uniform with pride, not as manipulation, but as a reminder of my duty to speak truth regardless of the consequences." When Sterling finally concluded his cross-examination, he had not only failed to discredit Marcus but had actually strengthened the prosecution's case by revealing his own disrespect for military service. The jury's body language showed clearly that they had been disgusted by his tactics and impressed by Marcus's dignity under fire. Judge Whitfield's redirect examination was brief, allowing Marcus to clarify a few technical points and reaffirm his commitment to truth and accuracy. As he left the witness stand, the courtroom was electric with tension and emotion. Several veterans in the gallery stood as he walked past, a gesture of respect that was not lost on the jury. The prosecution rested their case that afternoon, confident that Marcus's testimony had provided the foundation for a conviction. The defense would present their case over the next several days, but Sterling's disastrous cross-examination had already damaged their credibility with the jury. As the day ended, Marcus felt drained but satisfied. He had told the truth clearly and completely, and he had maintained his dignity despite Sterling's attacks. Whatever the jury ultimately decided, he knew he had fulfilled his duty to his fellow soldiers and to the oath he had sworn so many years ago. The third day of the trial brought unexpected drama that no one could have anticipated. News of Sterling's disrespectful treatment of Marcus had spread through military circles and social media overnight, creating a groundswell of support for the decorated soldier. Veterans organizations had issued statements condemning Sterling's tactics, and military personnel from around the country were calling for justice in the Harrison case. Judge Whitfield arrived at court that morning to find her chambers flooded with messages from concerned citizens, military families, and legal professionals expressing outrage at the previous day's events. She also received a formal letter from the British Embassy, expressing their government's support for Sergeant Major Thompson and noting his exemplary service record with the Royal Guard. The defense team arrived looking shaken and unprepared. Sterling had spent the night dealing with a public relations nightmare as his attack on Marcus's uniform had been widely reported and universally condemned. His law firm was receiving angry calls and emails, and several other clients were questioning whether they wanted to be represented by an attorney who showed such disrespect for military service. Harrison Military Solutions executives were in full crisis mode. The company's stock price had dropped 15% overnight as investors reacted to the damaging testimony and the public backlash against their legal representation. CEO Jonathan Harrison had been in emergency meetings with his board of directors, trying to develop a strategy to salvage the company's reputation. When court convened, Judge Whitfield made an unusual statement to the packed courtroom. Before we begin today's proceedings, I want to address yesterday's events. This court has always maintained the highest respect for our nation's service members and their sacrifice. Any suggestion that a decorated veteran's uniform is merely a costume or a tool for manipulation is deeply offensive and contrary to the values this court represents. She continued, Sergeant Major Thompson has earned the right to wear his uniform through years of distinguished service, and his credibility should be judged on the substance of his testimony and the evidence he has presented, not on inappropriate personal attacks. Sterling rose to his feet, clearly hoping to repair some of the damage from the previous day. Your Honor, if I may, I apologize for any offense my comments may have caused. It was not my intention to show disrespect to Sergeant Major Thompson's service record. Judge Whitfield's response was ice cold. Mr. Sterling, intentions matter less than actions and words. Your apology is noted, but the damage to the dignity of these proceedings has been done. I trust that the remainder of your case will be conducted with appropriate professional standards. The defense began their case that morning with their own expert witnesses, trying to challenge the technical aspects of Marcus's testimony. They brought in engineers and contract specialists who argued that the problems Marcus had identified were either normal wear and tear or the result of the challenging conditions in military operations overseas. But the defense experts faced immediate credibility problems. Several of them had financial relationships with Harrison or other defense contractors, and the prosecution was able to show that their opinions were influenced by these conflicts of interest. More damaging was the fact that none of them had actually visited the affected installations or examined the defective equipment firsthand. Dr. William Hayes, a mechanical engineer hired by the defense, testified that the water filtration failures Marcus had documented were within normal parameters for equipment operating in extreme conditions. But, under cross-examination, it was revealed that Hayes had never worked in military environments and had no experience with the specific filtration systems in question. Dr. Hayes, prosecutor Sarah Chun asked pointedly, have you ever been responsible for providing safe drinking water to soldiers in a combat zone? No, Hayes admitted, but the engineering principles are the same regardless of the application. Chun pressed further. Are you aware that substandard water filtration in military environments doesn't just cause inconvenience, but can incapacitate entire units and create tactical vulnerabilities? Hayes struggled to answer, clearly out of his depth when discussing the real-world implications of equipment failures in military settings. His testimony ended up reinforcing Marcus's credibility rather than undermining it. The defense's second expert witness was Dr. Margaret Foster, a materials scientist who attempted to justify Harrison's use of substandard building materials. She argued that the materials met civilian construction standards and that military specifications were unnecessarily stringent. But Foster's testimony backfired spectacularly when prosecutor Robert Martinez, drawing on his military background, asked her to explain why military construction standards existed in the first place. Dr. Foster, Martinez asked, "Are you familiar with the concept of hardening in military construction?" "I understand it refers to making structures more resistant to attack," Foster replied uncertainly. "And are you aware that military facilities must be able to withstand not just enemy fire, but extreme weather, seismic activity, and the stress of heavy equipment operations?" Foster's answers revealed that she had no understanding of why military construction standards were different from civilian ones. Her suggestion that these standards were unnecessarily stringent came across as ignorant and callous to jurors who understood that soldiers' lives depended on the integrity of their facilities. The defense's strategy of attacking the technical aspects of Marcus's testimony was clearly failing. Their experts lacked credibility and real-world experience, while Marcus had demonstrated both extensive knowledge and hands-on expertise with the systems in question. Sterling tried a different approach with his next witness, calling Harrison's former project manager for overseas operations, David Chun. Chun had been promised immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony, and Sterling hoped he would provide an insider's perspective that would exonerate the company. But Chun's testimony proved to be another disaster for the defense. Under direct examination, he tried to portray Harrison as a company that always prioritized safety and quality. He claimed that any problems were the result of miscommunication or the inherent difficulties of operating in war zones. Chin's credibility collapsed during cross-examination when prosecutor Sarah Chun, no relation, presented emails and internal documents that directly contradicted his testimony. The documents, which had been obtained through subpoena, showed that Chun himself had repeatedly warned Harrison's executives about safety problems and cost-cutting measures that violated contract specifications. One particularly damaging email, sent by Chun to CEO Jonathan Harrison, read, "We're playing Russian roulette with soldiers' lives. The corners we're cutting to increase margins are creating serious safety hazards. If someone gets killed because of our substandard equipment, we'll face criminal liability, not just civil suits." When confronted with this email, Chun claimed he couldn't remember writing it, despite the fact that it was sent from his corporate account and contained details that only he would have known. His obvious perjury undermined any remaining credibility the defense might have had with the jury. The prosecution's rebuttal was swift and devastating. They introduced additional evidence showing that Harrison's executives had been fully aware of the safety problems, but had chosen to prioritize profits over soldier welfare. Internal company documents revealed a corporate culture that viewed military contracts as opportunities for maximum profit extraction with minimal oversight. One particularly damning document was a PowerPoint presentation prepared for Harrison's board of directors, titled "Maximizing Margins on Government Contracts." The presentation explicitly discussed strategies for substituting cheaper materials and services while avoiding detection by military inspectors. It even included a cost-benefit analysis comparing the expense of providing proper equipment against the potential cost of lawsuits if soldiers were injured. The presentation contained a slide that would haunt the defense throughout the remainder of the trial. Military personnel are generally reluctant to complain about equipment problems, viewing them as part of the job. This cultural tendency provides opportunities for cost reduction that would not exist in civilian markets. Judge Whitfield's expression grew darker as this evidence was presented. The callous calculation involved in exploiting military culture for corporate profit clearly offended her sense of justice and decency. Sterling's final attempt to salvage his case involved calling character witnesses for Harrison's executives, hoping to portray them as patriotic Americans who would never deliberately endanger troops. But Even this strategy backfired when the prosecution revealed that several of these witnesses were either business partners or family members with obvious biases. The defense's case concluded with a whimper rather than a bang. Sterling's closing argument attempted to portray Harrison as a victim of overzealous prosecution and unrealistic military standards. He suggested that the company was being scapegoated for problems that were inherent in military operations, and that the prosecution was engaging in Monday morning quarterbacking of difficult decisions made under challenging circumstances. But Sterling's credibility with the jury had been destroyed by his treatment of Marcus and his presentation of obviously biased and uninformed expert witnesses. His suggestion that Harrison was merely a victim rang hollow in light of the overwhelming evidence of deliberate fraud and the company's callous disregard for soldier safety. The prosecution's closing argument was delivered by Sarah Chun with passion and precision. She systematically reviewed the evidence, connecting Harrison's cost-cutting measures directly to the injuries and deaths that had resulted from defective equipment. She reminded the jury of Marcus's credible testimony and contrasted it with the defense's parade of biased experts and perjurious witnesses. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Chun concluded, this case is about more than corporate fraud. It's about the sacred trust between our nation and those who serve it. When soldiers deploy overseas, they trust that their government will provide them with equipment and facilities that meet the highest standards of safety and quality. Harrison Military Solutions betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way, putting profits before the lives of the men and women who risk everything to keep us safe. She continued, Sergeant Major Thompson risked his career and his reputation to expose this fraud because he understood that his duty to his fellow soldiers was more important than any personal consideration. His courage in speaking truth to power is exactly the kind of integrity we should expect from our military personnel, and exactly the kind of accountability we should demand from those who profit from military contracts. Chin's closing was interrupted several times by emotion from the gallery, including audible sobs from military family members who had been affected by Harrison's fraud. Judge Whitfield allowed these displays of emotion to continue, recognizing that they reflected the genuine human cost of the corporate misconduct that had been exposed during the trial. As Chun concluded her closing argument, the courtroom was electric with tension and anticipation. The evidence against Harrison was overwhelming. The defense case had been thoroughly discredited, and the jury appeared convinced of the company's guilt. But everyone knew that jury verdicts could be unpredictable, especially in complex corporate cases where technical evidence might confuse or overwhelm citizen jurors. The jury retired for deliberations late that afternoon, carrying with them the weight of one of the most significant military fraud cases in recent history. Their decision would not only determine Harrison's fate, but would send a message to the entire defense contracting industry about the consequences of betraying the trust of those who serve. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus remained seated in the gallery, surrounded by the veterans and military families who had supported him throughout the trial. His quiet dignity and unwavering commitment to truth had transformed him from a witness into a symbol of military integrity and moral courage. The wait for the jury's verdict would be agonizing for everyone involved, but Marcus felt at peace with his role in the proceedings. He had told the truth completely and courageously, and he had maintained his honor despite vicious personal attacks. Whatever the jury decided, he knew he had fulfilled his duty to his fellow soldiers and to the oath he had sworn to protect and defend. The jury deliberation stretched into its second day, creating an atmosphere of unbearable tension throughout the courthouse. Marcus had returned to his hotel room, but found himself unable to concentrate on anything other than the decision that 12 strangers were making behind closed doors. The weight of representing not just himself, but thousands of military personnel who had been affected by Harrison's fraud pressed heavily on his shoulders. News media had set up a virtual camp outside the courthouse, with reporters from major networks providing hourly updates on the deliberation status. The story had captured national attention, becoming a symbol of the larger questions about corporate accountability and the treatment of military personnel. Social media was flooded with messages of support for Marcus and calls for justice against Harrison Military Solutions. Inside the jury room, the 12 citizens were wrestling with one of the most complex and emotionally charged cases they had ever encountered. The foreman, retired teacher Robert Walsh, was struggling to keep the discussions focused on the evidence rather than the emotions that Sterling's treatment of Marcus had generated. "We all saw how that lawyer treated the sergeant," said Maria Santos, the nurse on the jury. "But we have to base our decision on the facts, not on how angry that made us feel." Construction foreman Bill Murphy disagreed. "But that tells us something about their character, doesn't it? If they're willing to disrespect a decorated veteran in public, what are they willing to do behind closed doors?" The jury spent the first day organizing the massive amount of evidence and testimony they had heard over the past week. Marcus's documentation was particularly impressive in its thoroughness and attention to detail. Every photograph had been properly dated and labeled, every technical report had been cross-referenced with military specifications, and every piece of correspondence had been preserved exactly as it had been received. College professor Dr. Elizabeth Turner, who had been elected jury foreperson, guided the group through a systematic review of each charge against Harrison. The evidence of overbilling was straightforward and undeniable. Company documents showed that Harrison had routinely charged premium prices for standard or substandard goods and services. More complex was the question of whether Harrison had knowingly endangered military personnel. This required the jury to understand technical specifications and to evaluate whether the company's executives had been aware that their cost-cutting measures created safety hazards. Mechanic Tony Rodriguez brought practical experience to these discussions. "Look, I've worked with equipment my whole life, and I can tell you that when someone substitutes cheaper parts, they know exactly what they're doing. You don't accidentally install substandard water filters or use inferior building materials. These were deliberate decisions." The jury's accountant, Jennifer Kim, had spent considerable time analyzing Harrison's financial records. The profit margins on these military contracts were enormous, she reported to her fellow jurors. They were making 2 to 3 times their normal markup by cutting corners on materials and services. That's not accidental cost saving. That's systematic fraud. Small business owner Frank Chun raised concerns about the complexity of military procurement and the challenges of operating in war zones. Maybe some of these problems were just the result of difficult conditions rather than deliberate wrongdoing, he suggested. But social worker Lisa Thompson countered with Marcus's testimony about Harrison's responses when problems were reported. "Remember what the sergeant said about how they reacted when he documented the problems. They didn't try to fix them, they tried to silence him. That tells us everything we need to know about their priorities." The jury's discussions were interrupted several times by requests to review specific pieces of testimony or evidence. They asked to see Marcus's photographs of the contaminated water systems again, and they requested transcripts of his exchanges with Sterling during cross-examination. Judge Whitfield had given the jury careful instructions about how to evaluate witness credibility, and Marcus's performance under hostile cross-examination had clearly impressed them. Several jurors commented on his composure and professionalism despite Sterling's aggressive tactics. That sergeant never got rattled, never lost his temper, never contradicted himself, observed homemaker Dorothy Williams. He answered every question directly and honestly, even when they were trying to make him look bad. Retail manager Kevin Lee agreed. And notice how he always referred to his documentation rather than just relying on memory. He wasn't trying to be dramatic or emotional. He was just presenting the facts. The jury also discussed the contrast between Marcus's testimony and that of the defense witnesses. Harrison's experts had been evasive, contradictory, and clearly biased. The company's former project manager had obviously committed perjury when confronted with his own emails. On the second day of deliberation, the jury began working toward a consensus on each individual charge. The overbilling charges were unanimous almost immediately. The evidence was simply too overwhelming to dispute, and even Harrison's own internal documents supported the prosecution's case. The endangerment charges required more discussion, but the jury was ultimately swayed by the human cost of Harrison's actions. They reviewed testimony about soldiers who had been sickened by contaminated water, injured by defective equipment, and placed at risk by substandard facilities. Foreman Walsh read aloud from Marcus's testimony about his brother David, who had been burned in the electrical fire caused by Harrison's faulty wiring. "This isn't just about money," Walsh said quietly. "This is about real people who were hurt because this company chose profits over safety." The jury also considered the broader implications of their verdict. If they failed to hold Harrison accountable, what message would that send to other defense contractors? Would it encourage more companies to cut corners at the expense of military personnel safety? Dr. Turner reminded the group of Judge Whitfield's instructions about the burden of proof. "We have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Harrison knowingly defrauded the government and endangered military personnel. Based on everything we've seen and heard, do any of you have reasonable doubts about their guilt?" One by one, the 12 jurors confirmed that the evidence had convinced them of Harrison's guilt on all charges. The company's own documents provided clear proof of deliberate fraud, and Marcus's meticulous documentation showed the real-world consequences of their actions. The jury sent word to Judge Whitfield that they had reached a verdict at 3:30 p.m. on the second day of deliberations. The announcement triggered a flurry of activity as lawyers, media representatives, and spectators rushed back to the courtroom. Marcus arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes before the verdict was to be announced, once again wearing his dress uniform with quiet dignity. He took his seat in the gallery surrounded by military personnel and family members who had supported him throughout the trial. Harrison's executives looked pale and nervous as they entered the courtroom with their legal team. CEO Jonathan Harrison avoided making eye contact with anyone, while Sterling appeared to have aged years during the brief deliberation period. Judge Whitfield entered the courtroom at exactly 4 p.m., her expression giving no indication of what the jury had decided. The bailiff called for order as the packed courtroom fell completely silent. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Whitfield asked formally, "have you reached a verdict in this case?" Dr. Turner stood and replied clearly, "Yes, Your Honor, we have. On the charge of conspiracy to defraud the United States government, how do you find?" "We find the defendant, Harrison Military Solutions, guilty." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause from the gallery, while Harrison's executives slumped in their chairs. Judge Whitfield called for order, but allowed the emotional response to continue for several moments. Dr. Turner continued reading the verdicts on each of the 17 separate charges. Guilty on overbilling. Guilty on providing substandard equipment. Guilty on endangering military personnel. Guilty on obstruction of justice. One by one, the verdicts demolished Harrison's defense and validated every aspect of Marcus's testimony. When the final verdict was read, the courtroom exploded in celebration. Veterans stood and applauded, military families wept with relief, and supporters chanted Marcus's name. Even several of the jurors were visibly emotional as they witnessed the reaction to their decision. Judge Whitfield allowed the celebration to continue for several minutes before restoring order. She thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for the following month. She also announced that Harrison Military Solutions would be immediately suspended from all government contracts pending the completion of the appeals process. After court was adjourned, Marcus was surrounded by well-wishers and supporters who thanked him for his courage in exposing Harrison's fraud. Military personnel from all branches of service lined up to shake his hand and express their gratitude for his service to the entire military community. Sarah Chun, the lead prosecutor, fought back tears as she addressed the media outside the courthouse. This verdict represents justice not just for the specific victims of Harrison's fraud, but for every service member who puts their life on the line trusting that their government will provide them with safe, reliable equipment and facilities. She continued, Sergeant Major Thompson's courage in coming forward and his integrity in testifying truthfully despite vicious personal attacks made this verdict possible. He exemplifies the best values of military service and American justice. Sterling declined to comment to the media, but Harrison's attorney announced that the company would appeal the verdict. However, legal experts noted that the overwhelming evidence and the jury's quick deliberation made a successful appeal highly unlikely. Marcus himself remained humble in victory, focusing on the broader implications of the verdict rather than his personal vindication. "This case was never about me," he told reporters. It was about ensuring that the men and women who serve our country receive the support and protection they deserve. Today's verdict sends a clear message that those who betray that trust will be held accountable. The evening news coverage focused heavily on the contrast between Marcus's dignity throughout the trial and Sterling's disrespectful treatment of his military service. Legal commentators noted that Sterling's tactical error in attacking Marcus's uniform had backfired spectacularly, turning the jury against the defense and ultimately contributing to Harrison's conviction. As the day ended, Marcus felt a profound sense of relief and satisfaction. The truth had prevailed, justice had been served, and his fellow service members had been vindicated. The long fight had been worth it, and the sacrifice of his own privacy and comfort had been justified by the verdict. But Marcus also knew that the fight was not over. Harrison would appeal, and other defense contractors would be watching to see whether the government would continue to pursue corporate fraud cases aggressively. The verdict was a victory, but it was also just the beginning of a larger battle for accountability in military contracting. 6 weeks after the verdict, the courtroom was once again packed for Harrison Military Solutions' sentencing hearing. The intervening weeks had been a whirlwind of activity as the case's impact rippled through military contracting industry and government oversight agencies. Congressional hearings had been announced, new investigations launched, and several other defense contractors had come under scrutiny for similar practices. Marcus had spent the time since the verdict testifying before Congress and working with military investigators to identify other instances of contractor fraud. His detailed documentation and systematic approach to quality control had become a model for military oversight procedures, and he had been asked to help develop new standards for contractor accountability. Judge Whitfield entered the courtroom for the sentencing hearing with a thick file of victim impact statements, sentencing recommendations, and character references. The case had attracted attention from the highest levels of government, including letters from the Secretary of Defense and the British ambassador expressing support for Marcus and calling for severe punishment of Harrison's executives. The prosecution had requested the maximum possible sentence for the company and its executives, arguing that the scope and duration of the fraud warranted the harshest possible punishment. They had also requested that Harrison be permanently barred from government contracts and that the company's executives face individual criminal charges. Sterling had filed numerous pre-sentencing motions attempting to minimize his client's culpability and requesting lenient sentences based on Harrison's supposed cooperation with investigators. However, these motions were undermined by evidence that the company had continued to obstruct investigations even after the verdict. Before proceeding to sentencing, Judge Whitfield made an unprecedented decision to allow victim impact statements from affected military personnel. Over the next 2 hours, a parade of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines testified about how Harrison's fraud had affected their lives and the lives of their fellow service members. Staff Sergeant Michael Chun, who had been one of the soldiers injured in the electrical fire at Marcus's brother David's base, testified about the physical and emotional trauma caused by Harrison's substandard electrical work. "I spent 8 months in the burn unit," Chun said, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind his words. But the worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was knowing that someone had cut corners to save money and that my injuries were completely preventable. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, whose unit had been repeatedly sickened by contaminated water at a Harrison-managed facility, described the tactical implications of the fraud. When a quarter of your unit is down with dysentery, you can't complete your mission effectively. Harrison's actions didn't just endanger individual soldiers. They compromised our entire operation and put civilians at risk. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from the parents of Private First Class James Wilson, who had been killed when a Harrison-built observation tower collapsed during a routine patrol. Wilson's father, a Vietnam veteran himself, spoke directly to Harrison's executives as he described his son's death. "My boy trusted that his equipment would keep him safe," Wilson's father said, his voice breaking with emotion. "He trusted that the people back home would give him the best protection money could buy. Instead, you gave him a death trap to save a few $1,000s on construction materials." The impact statements continued throughout the morning, each one adding weight to the mounting evidence of Harrison's callous disregard for human life. Judge Whitfield listened intently to every word, occasionally asking questions about specific incidents or requesting clarification about technical details. When the victim impact statements concluded, Sterling rose to present Harrison's case for leniency. His argument focused on the company's economic contributions and its supposed commitment to reform. He argued that destroying the company would harm innocent employees and reduce competition in the defense contracting industry. Your Honor, Sterling pleaded, Harrison Military Solutions has been a significant contributor to our national defense for over 30 years. While mistakes were made, the company is committed to implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure these problems never happen again. Sterling's argument fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence of systematic fraud and the powerful testimony from affected service members. Several spectators in the gallery shook their heads in disgust as he attempted to portray Harrison as a victim of overzealous prosecution. The prosecution's sentencing recommendation was delivered by Sarah Chun with the same passion and precision that had characterized her entire presentation of the case. She systematically reviewed the scope of Harrison's fraud, the number of affected service members, and the ongoing impact of the company's actions. Your Honor, Chun argued, this case represents one of the most egregious betrayals of military trust in recent history. Harrison Military Solutions systematically defrauded the government of millions of dollars while simultaneously endangering the lives of the men and women who serve our country. The only appropriate response is the maximum penalty allowed by law. Chun also addressed Harrison's supposed commitment to reform. Defendants often claim they will reform after being caught, but Harrison's behavior during this investigation and trial shows their true character. They attempted to intimidate witnesses, destroyed evidence, and showed complete disrespect for military service members and this court. Before announcing her sentence, Judge Whitfield delivered one of the most powerful judicial statements in recent memory. Her words would later be quoted in law schools and military academies as a definitive statement on military contractor accountability. This case has revealed a level of corporate greed and moral bankruptcy that is difficult to comprehend. Judge Whitfield began. The defendants in this case took advantage of the most sacred trust in our society, the trust between a nation and those who serve it in uniform. They exploited that trust not once, not accidentally, but systematically over many years. She continued, the evidence has shown that Harrison Military Solutions executives knew that their actions were endangering military personnel. They had clear documentation of safety problems, yet they chose to prioritize profits over human lives. This is not mere corporate malfeasance. It is a betrayal of the fundamental values that make military service possible. Judge Whitfield then turned her attention to Marcus's role in exposing the fraud. This court has been deeply impressed by the courage and integrity demonstrated by Sergeant Major Thompson throughout this proceeding. Despite facing intense pressure and personal attacks, he never wavered from his commitment to truth and his duty to his fellow service members. The judge's voice rose with emotion as she addressed the broader implications of the case. Military personnel who deploy overseas face enough dangers from enemy action and environmental hazards. They should never have to worry about whether their own government's contractors are providing them with safe, reliable equipment and facilities. Judge Whitfield then announced Harrison's sentence, a fine of $500 million, permanent disbarment from government contracts, and individual prison sentences for the company's top executives. CEO Jonathan Harrison received 12 years in federal prison, while other executives received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years. The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers as the sentences were announced. Military personnel and family members wept with relief and gratitude, while Harrison's executives sat in stunned silence. The severity of the sentences sent a clear message to the entire defense contracting industry about the consequences of defrauding the military. After sentencing was completed, Judge Whitfield made a final statement that would become legendary in military and legal circles. Looking directly at Marcus, who was seated in the front row of the gallery, she said, Sergeant Major Thompson, your courage in coming forward and your integrity throughout this proceeding represent the best traditions of military service. You have honored your oath and served your fellow service members with distinction. She continued, "But I want to address something else that occurred during this trial. Mr. Sterling's attack on your uniform and his suggestion that your military decorations were merely a costume was not just disrespectful. It was an attack on everything you and your fellow service members represent." Judge Whitfield's voice grew stronger as she addressed the packed courtroom. Every ribbon on Sergeant Major Thompson's uniform represents sacrifice, service, and commitment to something larger than oneself. To suggest that such service is theatrical or manipulative reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what military service means to our society. The judge then did something unprecedented in her long career. She stood up behind the bench and began to applaud Marcus, setting off a wave of applause that swept through the entire courtroom. Every person present, prosecutors, defense attorneys, court staff, spectators, and even some of the defendant's family members, rose to their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation. For nearly 5 minutes, the applause continued as Marcus sat quietly in his seat, overwhelmed by the unexpected recognition. The standing ovation was not just for him personally, but for every service member who had ever been dismissed, disrespected, or underestimated because of their background or appearance. When the applause finally died down and the courtroom returned to normal, Judge Whitfield made her final remarks. "This case will stand as a reminder that those who serve our country deserve our respect, our support, and our protection. It will also serve as a warning to anyone who would exploit military personnel for personal gain. Justice will find you." In the weeks following the sentencing, Marcus became a reluctant celebrity as his story spread throughout military and civilian communities. He received thousands of letters from service members thanking him for his courage, and several universities offered him positions teaching military ethics and leadership. The case's impact extended far beyond the courtroom. Congress passed new legislation strengthening oversight of military contractors, and the Department of Defense implemented Marcus's quality control procedures across all military installations. Several other defense contractors settled fraud cases rather than risk facing the kind of scrutiny Harrison had endured. Marcus himself returned to his duties with the Royal Guard, but his experience had changed him profoundly. He had learned that standing up for truth and justice required not just courage, but persistence in the face of attacks on his character and credibility. The case also had a lasting impact on the legal profession. Sterling's disrespectful treatment of Marcus became a cautionary tale taught in law schools about the importance of treating all witnesses with dignity and respect. Several state bar associations cited the Harrison case when updating their ethical guidelines for attorney conduct. Years later, when military personnel faced similar challenges with contractor fraud or safety issues, they would often invoke Marcus's name and example. He had shown that one person's commitment to truth and justice could make a difference, even against powerful corporate interests. The standing ovation that day in Judge Whitfield's courtroom became a symbol of respect for military service and the power of moral courage. It reminded everyone present that honor, duty, and integrity were not just abstract concepts, but living values that could change the world when embodied by individuals willing to stand up for what is right. Marcus Thompson had entered that courtroom as a witness in a fraud case. He left as a symbol of everything that military service represents at its best: courage, honor, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to protecting those who serve alongside you. His story would be told and retold in military units around the world, inspiring future generations of service members to uphold the highest standards of integrity and moral courage. The case was officially closed, but its legacy would continue for generations. Marcus had proven that truth, properly presented and courageously defended, remains the most powerful force for justice in any courtroom. And he had shown that sometimes, when we stand up for what is right, we receive recognition and support from the most unexpected places.